Hello, everyone. Welcome to the SMITE Comprehensive Guide to Hades. I'll be talking about building Hades in this particular episode for both the solo lane and the mid lane. These are the two lanes that I find him most effective in. This is a request, well, kind of a request by Urgot RL. The difference here is that Urgot RL did ask for a versus Hades video, but unfortunately, since I can't guarantee my opponent will be Hades, I instead will be talking about playing Hades in the role, what he does and does not want to see in the lane, and additionally, how you would fight against that. But I'm in here in this jungle practice really specifically because not everyone understands how Hades' abilities work, and I want to talk about that very briefly. Alright? So, let's run through his kit really quick. So this smoke covering these minions is known as Blight. The main point of Blight is to provide his abilities with a secondary additional effect. Secondarily, the Blight reduces enemy power by 5%, which sounds cool on the surface, but then you realize that with the maximum power levels accessible by most gods, it really doesn't mean that much. Physical gods have a theoretic power ceiling of 400. Very few reach this, but they have a power ceiling of 400, which means in a, I guess, best case scenario, which is the best case scenario here being that the enemy has max power, not a happy thought, but anyways, in a best case scenario for Blight, a physical god will have their power reduced by a whopping 20. Yes, not very high. Even magic gods who have a power cap of 900 still are only really losing 45 power out of Blight. So, not really the main goal of Blight here. The main goal of Blight is not to reduce power. It's just a secondary bonus effect to make it more than just secondary effects on your abilities, right? And his first two abilities are really simplified, right? They're really easy to understand. Death from Below is this. If the enemy is blighted, then they are slowed, and that blight is refreshed. If they're not blighted, they're blighted now, right? Very straightforward. His second ability, Shroud in Darkness, is a silence if the enemy is not blighted, and a fear if they are. That doesn't seem like a really big deal on the surface until you realize that Shroud of Darkness is one of the very few instant activate silences in the game. The only other one I can think of off the top of my head is Ganesh's. Now, you might throw Eset at me as a name. However, Eset's silence actually takes 0.5 seconds to actually trigger, so somebody with a good enough reaction time, and there are people out there who do have this, they can realize that you're about to silence them and really quickly blast out their beads. Why does this matter? Because if they're using an ability that you really want to interrupt via the silence, if they beads through it, that ability isn't going to be interrupted. This is one of the beautiful things about both Ganesh's silence and Hades' silence, is it just happens then and there. Now this means a bit more to Hades in the solo role because there are more enemies in that lane who generally tend to bring long-lasting abilities such as dashes or just sustained abilities. Think of all the dashes that are available to various warriors. As an example, Faman, Tyr, or Longshen, Sun Wukong. Bellona's Hammer as a non-dash example. A lot of assassins as well. For example, Fenrir's Brutalize as a prime example. So a lot of your most common laning opponents are going to be bringing to bear some sort of ability that can be interrupted by silence, and having an insta-use silence is very important. This is less accurate in mid lane, where not a whole lot of mages have really sustained abilities. Nox and Anubis are two that I can think of off the top of my head that do, as well as Eset, speaking of the devil, but beyond those three, there's not a hell of a lot of other people who have sustained ability uses. Raijin comes to mind as well as an example. So just kind of be aware that that is an instant use thing, and that can really come in handy. But it's the Devour Souls and the Pillar of Agony that are the least understood. Now, a lot of people see Hades using Devour Souls, and they see a wildly varying amount of damage and healing being done, and they not everyone understands why. That is because it is not the actual slam itself that does this. It's actually the blight exploding. Watch as I pop the ability here. Did you see those circles come out of the minions? That was the blight exploding. Now that blight explosion deals additional damage per individual blight explosion and heals allies, which is something else a lot of people either don't know or don't know the intricacies of. It is not Hades himself that is healing you with Devour Souls. It is the Blight Explosion. So if you wanted to get healing from Hades, you need to be standing next to Hades' victims, not Hades himself. Furthermore, again, in order to avoid the brunt of the damage from this ability, you want to be standing near Hades, theoretically, depending on the situation. But the one place you don't want to be standing next to is the majority of his victims. If you're in a team fight and you're afraid that Hades is about to devour your soul, don't stand next to your allies, because their souls being devoured is going to cause their blights to pop, and you're going to take additional damage. Now, it's important to note that, yes, enemy gods only take half damage from these blights, but that's still a hell of a lot of damage. Consider the average scenario right here in a minion wave. Right? Let's say your laning opponent is Sun Wukong, and he's running up to the front line of your wave to use his magic cudgel to hit your whole wave. This puts him right at the front of his wave as well. He's going to be amongst the physical frontline waves. You blast in with this, and then boom, you immediately devour souls afterwards, and you've just hit him 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. 6 including his blade, actually. How? Well, you hit him with the death from below. For, in this case, I'm level 20 with no items, 270 damage. Then you use Devour Souls on him. This is 235 by itself. And then you have the 3 minions exploding for literally 25 here. And then you have him exploding for also 25. Right? So he's just taken 100 damage from the 4 detonated blights, 235 damage from the actual Devour Souls itself, and 270 damage from Death from Below. But that's an additional 100 damage from blights alone, blight explosions alone. Okay? And this is, again, with 0 power. Now that's an idealized scenario, obviously, but it's not that unusual for something similar to happen in team fights where a lot of people are grouped up. Typically, Hades can nail 3 people, which is 3 blight explosions, which is generally going to be kicking around minimum 75 damage additional, okay? And that can get very out of hand very quickly. And furthermore, if you're in the middle of some kind of fight with the enemy front line, Hades swoops in, blasts your face off with Devour Souls detonating your blight. Guess what? The people you're fighting in melee range are now healed from that blight detonating. This is what makes Hades scary. This is also his greatest flaw in the solo lane, as well as the mid lane to some extent. But that's a bit of a different scenario we'll talk about in a bit. But for solo lane specifically, this means that contrary to how a lot of solo laners want to play, Hades wants to fight you in wave. This right here, with all these minions here, Hades wants this. Hades is going to, a good Hades at least, will chase you down and try his damnedest to fight you in the middle of your own minions. Because that is the dream. That is what he is good at. He will blast you for additional damage, heal himself an absolute truckload of health right in the middle of your wave, and completely turn around what you thought was a great battle because you had minion advantage. Again, this is very counterintuitive to how a lot of gods in solo lane want to work. Very few other gods want that mid-minion fight. The only one I can think of off the top of my head that sometimes wants it, depending on the scenario, is Tyr. Right? There are some gods that can ignore minions temporarily. Vamon ulting, for instance, doesn't much care. But by and large, very few of your opposition, as Hades, will want to fight in wave. Now, if you're fighting against Hades, what this basically means is stay the hell away from your own minions and do not fight him if your minions are alive. The instant he kills your wave, that's when you go in. You box him, you do as much damage as you can, and you get the hell out of dodge. You don't want a sustained combat with him. Basically, it's like skirmishing. You use one ability, ideally, against his wave, finish them off with auto attacks. He kills your wave, then you go in. use the rest of your abilities, save your escape if he has his ult. Use the rest of your abilities, try to get some damage on him, disengage, and just kind of do basically what the equivalent would be like World War II fighter plane sorties, right? You're going out there for a quick strafing run of damage, and then you're getting back to safety. Similar idea. But what really clinches this deal, beyond just devouring souls, is his ult. Alright, his ult is scary. Now, I want you to pay attention to two things. I'm going to wait until the next Dominion wave comes up. But when I ult as Hades, I want you to pay attention to two specific things. First, check his protections. They're going to increase by 160 while he's in the middle of that ult. Second, watch his cooldowns. He reduces his cooldowns by 0.2 seconds for every hit on every enemy. Go ahead and blast these out here. I think I was a little early on that, but let's go ahead and grab these. Boom. Observe. The Nightmare. The Abject Terror. Okay, this is a big deal. This is why, after Hades is done ulting, he's blasting you with the rest of his kit all over again. It's not because his cooldowns are incredible. It's because his ult is actually actively reducing his cooldown timers while he's using it. Each time he hits somebody with it, actually. Furthermore, it's not just 160 protections at max level. It's actually 160 protections at max level plus 10% damage mitigation. Now, the 10% damage mitigation doesn't care what level the ult is, but the ult starts off giving him 60 of both protections and then works its way up to 160. Regardless, at the time that he uses it, that is a spike in his protections. Alright, and it's spooky. Okay? This is why Pillar of Agony is scary. Furthermore, you might notice the word protections debuff. Yes, it's true. He's reducing both your protections by 30 for the duration of his ult, as long as you're in there chilling out. So while you might be able to get out, but you feel like maybe you want to turn around and attack him, do not. Unless it is somehow a 5v1, and even then Hades, if built properly, doesn't mind too much. You really don't want to engage with that. Alright, what Hades wants in a perfect world, and I'm going to go on ahead into the Odin bots for this. In a perfect world for Hades, Hades engages with the enemy team like so, pops in here, silences y'all, blasts you with Devour Souls for a ton of damage and healing, and then ults. While he's ulting, his allies come in and slap tomorrow out of you, okay? Because you have reduced protections, and you're obviously being sucked into a vortex. So if you can get out of his ult in the middle of a team fight, do so. Because if he's using it in the middle of a team fight, he's trying to lock you there and reduce your protections so somebody else can kill you if he somehow doesn't. Okay? And if you're thinking about turning around and trying to smack him, good luck. Unless you're a hunter with Ferocious Executioner and Chin Size very specifically, you're probably not going to outdamage him in the ult. Alright? Again, his protection spike, he gets damage mitigation. He's probably built some lifesteal, so he's healing at the same time. Run. If you can get out of that ult, do so. Scary part is, not everyone can. A lot of his lane competition will be able to. A lot of solo laners, a lot of warriors and assassins tend to be able to get out of this. But a lot of mages and a lot of hunters really don't have that capacity. And even the ones that do typically have to use their ults to do so. Some assassins, for Pete's sakes, need to use their ults to get out of this. Arachne, for instance. Okay? This is a very threatening ability in any team fight. Alright? And this is a huge reason why Hades is so scary in team fights. Again, between that and Devour Souls, he wants large group fights. Try to avoid having them with him. If there's minions, do not engage. If he's got a whole bunch of allies and he's clearly looking for a scrap, do not engage. Unless you can somehow intimidate his allies away. Because that's what he wants. Okay? Now for building Hades. I deviate from the norm here with a lot of people, and I'll talk about why I do. But let's get into that. Now that we have a better understanding of Hades' kit. Alright, so starter items for Hades is a fun fun time. In the solo lane, very specifically, I generally stick to one of two starter items, with the rare exception of the occasional Tainted Steel. I'm going to talk about Tainted Steel first because there's extremely specific scenarios I use this in. Tainted Steel, I only build if I anticipate that my laning opponent is going to be Mulan, Famana, or Sun Wukong, because these three are the only ones who can match Hades' sustain and in fact do a good enough job boxing him out of wave where Hades has a justified right to be afraid. Okay? These three are probably a worst case scenario for Hades in a lot of situations. Really good Gilgamesh does as well, but that's harder to gauge. And even then, really good Gilgameshes don't heal enough self-heal wise to require Tainted Steel. Okay? But for Sun Wukong, Vman, and Mulan, these three, if I'm expecting them to be in my lane, I'm busting out Tainted Steel. It's the only situations I'll bust Tainted Steel out in. Possibly Zhong Kui, but I haven't had a matchup of Hades versus Zhong Kui in a hot minute in the solo lane because people have stopped using Zhong Kui in the solo lane, but possibly Zhong Kui as well. Outside of those very specific scenarios, my choices are basically Conduit Gem or Warrior's Axe. Now, both of these do offer a burst of bonus damage. Warrior's Axe is not dependent on really anything. It's just regular old stealing health away, right? And mana as well. Whereas Conduit Gem, instead of stealing mana, gives you MP5 and, of course, does additional true damage on your abilities. Which one I pick depends on how tanky I expect my laning opponent to be. If I expect my laning opponent to be a warrior or a guardian, or one of the tankier assassins or mages, for example, Fenrir or Anubis respectively, I'll bust out Conduit Gem, right? Conduit Gem is pretty important for Hades because in between waves, the enemy is, like I said, a good enemy is going to try to damage you as much as possible. Well, you can return that blow for blow a little bit better with Conduit Gem. It's still not ideal, obviously. Hades loves those group fights, but Conduit Gem does give him a really nice surprise amount of damage that not a lot of people are prepared for, honestly. Similar kind of idea with Warrior's Axe, but instead of it being true damage, it's just a regular low grade health steal. But the important thing here is, while he does lose 10 power, and of course the true damage version of this passive, he is getting bonus protections, and I'll usually build this against much more aggressive enemies. For example, some of the more damaging mages or assassins, or pretty much any hunter in the game, if I'm expecting one of them to show up in the solo lane. As you can probably imagine, most of the time I'm busting out Conduit Gem, and it's a pretty sweet deal. So let's run with this as an example. Now, I do want to talk very quickly. I know some people build Vampiric Shroud. However, the reason I don't really prefer Vampiric Shroud, and there are a couple of reasons. One, the passive of 4 health is okay, but it's okay. It's an acceptable choice here. It doesn't hit as hard, but it gives him more sustain. The problem is that the sustain from Vampiric Shroud, 4 health and 6 mana per target per ability, a lot of this is additional healing and mana in the middle of waves. It doesn't really help Hades in 1v1 scenarios like Warrior's Axe or Conduit Gem can. Right? This is just whenever you're using an ability on an opponent is just, for Hades, because he only has 3 damaging abilities, that's only, 12 health and 18 mana, right? You get more than that you get more than that straight up with Warrior's Axe every 10 seconds, right? So I'm not a huge fan of Vampiric Shroud on Hades, right? And you might think to yourself, well, Hades is 2 regular damaging abilities and his ult, they don't change. You still have 1 ability that doesn't do damage. Why is Conduit Gem and Warrior's Axe so much better, right? Well, primarily because these are timed effects. Warrior's Axe happens every 10 seconds. You can use your silence between that time, obviously, very easily because it's a whole 10 seconds of cooldown, right? Similar thing with Conduit Gem. This is just going to, pop every time you use a damaging ability, and it's just going to build up stacks in the meantime. So busting out your silence as a second or 2 of usage in terms of animation for Hades, giving you a couple of extra points of true damage on your next ability, right? That doesn't really happen with Vampiric Shroud because, again, it is healing you health and mana based on hitting enemies with abilities. And again, while this is really good in Wave, Hades doesn't need any more help in Wave. He already wants that fight in Wave, right? So, while yes, it can really emphasize the strengths of Hades, it does nothing to cover his weaknesses, which early on in the game are glaring. Also, keep in mind, and this is something that a lot of people forget, is that Hades, despite being a tankier than average mage, is still a mage. Let me show you his default stats, his level 1 stats. Boom! 750 HP, 28 physical protections, 40 magic protections. This is far lower than most of his contemporaries, warriors, guardians, tankier assassins like Fenrir, right? He has a defensive disadvantage, especially in 1v1 scenarios. Now, in the middle of a wave, again, he can make up for that by being able to heal and inflict large amounts of damage because of the increased number of enemies. But in 1v1 scenarios, he does not have that to fall back on. While Vampiric Shroud can be very good, you are heavily banking on winning your fights in the middle of lanes, and in order to win those fights, you need to prevent the enemy from escaping. And there's just a lot of solo lane mains right now, right? A lot of warriors who can easily get away from Hades. Tyr, Sun Wukong, if you fail to silence him out of 72 transformations, and even then he can still ult out if he really wants to. You've got Vman, who's got his ult and his dash, right? You've got all kinds of options, or at least a lot of warriors have all kinds of options of getting away from you. Alright, so it makes Vampiric Shroud very difficult to capitalize on if you don't have the right matchup. And in a lot of cases, I would still prefer the Conduit Gem because, again, I don't need any help in the healing or damage dealing in groups department. I need additional help in the slapping my enemy in the face in a 1v1 department. And it just so happens that Conduit Gem, being my favorite, also happens to additionally help in Wave, right? Clear the wave a little faster, which gives you, if you need to, right, clear the wave a little bit faster, but it gives you some great poke on the enemy using Death from Below, and allows you, if you need to wipe out the wave if the pressure is getting too heavy, right? So, while I know people do use Vampiric Shroud, and it does emphasize his strengths as a solo laner, I struggle to justify it when I'm facing down my opponent in an otherwise empty lane, and I have no backup plan, right? So that's why I don't like Vampiric Shroud as a starter item, very specifically. So now that we've had that whole conversation, let's talk about the second item, because this also is somewhere I deviate from quite a bit. Now, a lot of people like Bancroft's Talon as a second item on Hades, if they're not building stacks. Okay? And Bancroft's Talon is an okay pick, but my issues with Bancroft's Talon are namely, again, referring back to the fact that Hades is a very squishy target early on in the solo lane. He is still a mage. As great as that additional 100 power and 20% lifesteal sound at low levels of health here, chances are once you get that low, you're one step away from death, okay? That is a very short leap from maxing Bancroft's and death. And again, this additionally does emphasize his strengths. That extra power, that extra lifesteal really pulls its weight in the middle of a wave, where he's healing extra. He's dealing extra damage, right? He's hitting multiple targets. In that 1v1, again, not the biggest deal. Yes, sometimes it really comes in clutch, but at the end of the day, it's not as useful in 1v1 scenarios, or a bunch of other scenarios for that matter, as my personal preference, Spear the Magus. Now, Spear the Magus I like because it does give you almost the same amount of baseline magic lifesteal. It's 3% less than Bancroft's base of 15, but more importantly is the passive and the penetration. Okay? Whereas Bancroft's Talon, right here, that is giving additional 100 power, right? And the scaling on very specifically, the blight detonation is 50% scaling, right? So you're getting, in an optimized scenario, you're getting 50 extra power, 50 extra damage out of the baseline power, and then another 50 power out of the passive power. But remember that the enemy is only taking half of that, right? So we're actually getting an additional 25 plus an additional 25 on the explosions. Now, yes, for Death from Below, and also for the core Devour Souls, sure, yeah, that's an extra 60 to 120 power and an additional 70 to 140 damage. I said power before, whoops. His ult, though, only has a 30% scaling. Yeah, sure, it hits a bunch of times, yes, but it's still only 30% scaling. But the passive here and the penetration are a huge deal when combined with Hades. Think about it for a second. First off, you're Hades. You don't need that much more help healing in the middle of a wave. Sure, yes, it does give you bonus healing in the middle of the enemy wave. Absolutely. Do you really need that much more right at the early game when you're most likely to die, right? I'm thinking no. Spirit of the Magus allows you to do quite a bit more damage by, instead of increasing your power, decreasing the enemy's protections with the 15 penetration, and providing a mark for 7.5% increased damage, including 7.5% increased damage from each individual detonated blight. Also from his ult, which incidentally is also reducing their protections while it's going on. Alright, so even when the enemy does start to build their magic protections, which is usually their third item, Bancroft's falls off. Or it starts to, because this is just pure power, there's no penetration here. And as you can see from Hades level 1, everyone has higher baseline magic protections than physical. It's across the board, right? And a warrior or a guardian would have even higher magic protection baseline, right? So once the enemy starts building their magic protections, this isn't really healing you as much off of them, which is also why it doesn't really help you between waves when you're 1v1ing them, right? Not really a great help. But Spirit of the Magus reduces their protections ahead of time, and again, increases the damage from everything you're doing. Your ult, Death from Below, your auto attacks, for Pete's sakes, which, again, your auto attacks only have a default 20% scaling off of your power. But they're also at their strongest in the early game when your power isn't that high and your auto attacks aren't really being bolstered by that much magic power, right? Because your flat magic power is really going to make the deal here. For example, let me give you an example of this. We build Bancroft's Talon, right? We have 125. You can see the difference. It's about 20 damage here, right? You get an additional 20 damage when you're low on health, which is, again, very risky. We get similar amounts. We actually hit up to just over to 60 because the obvious bonus 10 power there. But unlike with Bancroft's Talon, we have 15 Magic Pen, which means it'll actually be mitigated less. Let me give you an example here. Where's an Odin? Yeah. So compare the Odin, right? No, we would be at level... Let's assume we're level 5 here, okay? Just for kicks. Give me the level up. There we go. Thank you. Alright, let's talk... We have 52 damage, right? That's being mitigated by the Odin's magic protections. Let's pop back out of here. Grab Bancroft's. 45. Right? That doesn't even include the bonus power from Bancroft's, sure, but it also doesn't include the mark from the Spirit of the Magus. Alright? And the abilities are going to operate in an extremely similar way. Behold. You're matching my level exactly, but... Alright, let's run with you. Alright? We have here Boom. 140 damage. I'm ignoring the bonus damage from the conduit gem, obviously. Right? So that was 140 damage. Let's do that one more time. Boom. 140 damage. Lovely. Alright. Boom. 162 damage. Okay? Again, keep in mind, this is not the low health Bancroft's bonus, but that first Devour Souls, because the mark hadn't been on Odin at that time, that did not include that. What if we included that? Boom. Plenty more, right? It was a bit hard to see, so I'm going to do it again. Where's my cooldowns? That was a bit tough to see. I'll give you that. We're just going to go on ahead and actually... Yeah. Boink. 117 there. 364 there. Right? Let's do that one more time. Boop. Boop. 162 plus the 34 from the detonated blight. The detonated blight, by the way, doing a fair bit extra damage. Now that's 34 based on, again, 20 reduced by half, increased by my power. Well, actually, excuse me. 20 plus my power, decreased in half, plus the 7.5%. Right? 34. Not bad. But that works a little bit better for you than the equivalent on Bancroft's Talons. So I just prefer Spear of the Magus for a lot of these reasons. Right? And you're still going to get a really strong amount of healing. Not as much, obviously, but you're going to be hitting considerably harder. Okay? So I'm really fond of Spear of the Magus. I will build Bancroft's at my 4th item when we have some protections to actually keep us at the low health and not just keel over right afterwards. And speaking of protection items, let's talk about them. Now, I only really have 2 choices on Hades for protection items, at least the way I build him. If my laning opponent is physical, and again, this isn't solo lane, remember. If my laning opponent is physical, I'm going to be busting out Breastplate of Valor. I want those cooldowns, I want that MP5, I want that mana, right? It's solo lane. This is usually my go-to physical protection. If you're a bit more aggressive, you might consider going for Celestial Legion Helm. It gives you some magic power. It gives you a respectable amount of magic power. Less protections. Yeah, you've got the passive temporary ones, but I'm not so fond of those. And it doesn't give you cooldowns, so I generally don't go for this. But if you really want that extra damage, you can go for that. Pardon me. If my laning opponent is magic, then I'm busting out the ever-popular Oni Hunter's Garb, right? And now there's a specific reason for this. First off, health. I'll get on to that in a bit. The magic protection is obviously great MP5, and additionally, 3% damage mitigation up to 3 times for each enemy near you. Let me ult 3 people. Behold, I have 19% damage mitigations right now. Behold, I have 9% damage mitigations right now. Oni Hunter's Garb combined with Hades' ult makes him considerably tougher to kill, even at low protection levels. Not only do you get the 160 of each protection at level 20, but you're getting 10% damage mitigation. And in fact, if your laning opponent is magic, you're going to have 19% damage mitigation. Whenever you build this, let's assume you're level 8 at this point, level 7 or 8, right? Level 7 or 8, 9, 10, whatever. Boom. 19% damage mitigation is in the middle of an ult. That's going to be really tough for a lot of people at that level range to be able to blast through, right? So I'm a huge fan of Oni Hunter's Garb on Hades. But let's go back and assume that I have the physical protections because most team comps have a warrior in the solo lane. I'm not glyphing this. I'll explain why right now. When I build Bancroft's. Now, at this point, Bancroft's is a lot more effective because now we have the mark from Spear of the Magus, so that power from Bancroft's is going a little farther. We have the penetration from Spear of the Magus, so we get that benefit as well on this power now. But that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is when we're low on health, we actually stand a decent chance of not keeling over right afterwards, right? Lovely. Additionally, and this is why you don't want the glyph on Breastplate of Valor, we can bust out Bancroft's Claw. Now, Bancroft's Claw is fascinating on Hades. Right? You get up to 3 stacks of hunger. Each of these stacks deals bonus damage equal to 0.5% of the enemy's max HP for every 75 magic power you have. Okay? That's not bad. Right now, we have 235. This is, quite frankly, 3 extra levels, right? 75, 150, and then 225. So we're 10 above the 225 we need to get an additional trigger. So we're at 1.5% of their max HP. That can hit up to 3 stacks. So we can do 4.5 of their max HP. Right? Lovely introduction. Right? And furthermore, we get a health shield of up to 4.5 at this particular point of our max health. Now our max health isn't anything to necessarily hugely write home about. We do have only 2,000. I'm going to round up here. We have 2,500-ish. Right? Okay. But the 5th item is only Hunter's Garb here. Boom. Now we're talking, well, okay, it wouldn't be 2,500 at the time you built Bancroft's Claw because you wouldn't probably be level 20 at that time, but now we're breaking 2,500 HP. Great for us. But now we get a little bit more out of that, right? And now we're talking about the last item. What do we use here? Well, the interesting thing about the last item on a solo lane Hades is that this is an extremely flexible slot for you. You can build a lot of different things and have it be very useful. My personal favorite happens to be good old Soul Gem. You get a nice burst of healing every 4th ability, which in this explosion of healing also does an additional burst of damage to the enemy. You get a little bit more lifesteal. You get a decent, respectable amount of 80 magic power, right? And that's going to bring us to 315, which is another bonus on Bancroft's. Now we're, rather than being at 1.5, going up to 4.5 for 3 stacks. Now we're at 2%, going up to 6%. Not bad, right? Lovely. And additionally, we get to heal allies. We're already giving allies the benefit of the Spirit that make us proc, along with ourselves, and they already want to be near us when we ult because they want to take advantage of the fact that we're reducing enemy protections. Why not heal them at the same damn time? It's a lovely day. Now, let's not be confused, though. I want to make sure you understand, this does not full proc Soul Gem by itself, right? You can see right there above my health bar, we only have 1 proc of Soul Gem here. But consider the usual scenario of... Hold on, let me bust this out really quick. Yeah. Can we actually kill you really quick? Hold on, come back here. Yeah, I'm just going to kill you really quick because this is going to be a pain in the neck otherwise. Boing. Alright, let me go clear these stacks really quick because I want to give you the example of what actually happens with Hades. Boom. Alright. Because there's actually 2 misunderstood parts of Soul Gem. On a successful hit of an ability, some people believe that this is a damaging hit. It doesn't have to be. Alright? So we have no stacks on Soul Gem. Now, when you're playing Hades and you're about to blast your ult into a team fight, this is the usual, regardless of, quite frankly, what role you're playing, you're usually going to want to go in like this. Kaboom, blam, pow, smack you with the ult. There it is. Oh, look, my cooldowns are back up. Boom. Death. Great. Absolutely fantastic. Everyone loves it to pieces. Okay? Blasting your full kit on an enemy is going to activate that Soul Gem as you're starting your ult. This means that any damage you might have taken is healed not only by devouring souls and the blade explosions, but also the burst of extra healing out of the Soul Gem, and also starting your ult does a burst of damage on that first hit to everyone nearby, which is the most successful hit, because that's going to be the hit that actually hits everyone, for Pete's sakes. Because even if they escape after the fact, they've still taken that first hit. Actually, they've probably taken a couple of hits by that point, but that first hit being the most devastating, because the Soul Gem proc means that even if they escape your circle, they've already taken the lion's share of the damage at that particular point. So you actually get value out of your ult even if they escape it right afterwards. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And that's why I really like Soul Gem, but there are a bunch of other options. Blythag's piece is great. Again, your allies are trying to stay near you. This is a really great pickup right here. Give them some extra power. Give them some delightful extra lifesteal, right? It's really nice. It can be very effective. Some people like Typhon's Fang. It's a really nice spike in your own personal power. It's 10% pen if you want that, right? Some people might go into Obsidian Shard for really tanky enemy comps, or maybe it's a really squishy comp and they want the extra damage out of Spear of Desolation, right? Lovely time. Also a great option. Some people might want to go for Chronos Pendant, get their ult up as often as possible, get their healing up as often as possible. Perfectly viable option, right? Some people like Rod of Tahuti. I don't. This is, of the items I've mentioned, this is probably one of my least favorites that isn't an attack speed item, because obviously we should stay away from those. Hades' attack speed is trash. But back to the main point. I don't really like this, at least on solo Hades, because you don't have as much magic power here to make that 25% additional magic power mean much. And yeah, sure, you've got a 25% power damage burst out of Soul Gem, but that's also a heal. Alright, and that's very specifically providing a burst of damage at the beginning of your ult, which is very easy to escape from for anybody with a dash or a jump. So making the most out of that first hit is kind of important for your ult to not be technically wasted. Well, Rod of Tahuti, unless you are ulting targets under 50% health, which isn't that common a lot of the times, you're usually initiating with this thing, at least as a solo lane Hades, it's really not going to trigger for your ult in time a lot of the time. So I just don't really like, very specifically, Rod of Tahuti, and at least for, again, solo lane. Mid lane Hades, that's a totally different conversation, but for solo lane Hades, I would recommend you stay away from Rod of Tahuti, alright? But there are other options as well. If you didn't build this earlier and you want that extra damage and maybe some physical protection, Celestial Legion Helm is great. If the enemy team is tanky and you've got a lot of mages on your team, or maybe you just want some damage and magic protections, you could go Voidstone. If you want magic protections but some cooldown, you've also got the lovely option of Genji's Guard. Beautiful thing. Or the benefits of Bulwark of Hope with that nice passive health shield. Another item I'm also very fond of, incidentally, by the way, speaking of health shields, is Book of the Dead. Beautiful item. Busts out a substantial shield for you when you're low on health. A great amount of magic power out of this bad boy. Lovely time. Another great option if the enemy team is particularly tanky is Soul Reaver. Get that percentage of health damage in there. It's a lovely time. One final thing I would like to mention really quickly as another great option here is very specifically Gem of Isolation. All of your damaging abilities don't necessarily prevent the enemy from moving. Technically your ult does, but that's a Vortex. And adding Gem of Isolation onto that means your first ability slows them even more. Your Devour Souls slows them, with practically guaranteed with all those plates detonating, in theory. And then you've got your ult busting out, slowing them down, making it impossible to escape your ult without the use of an escape move, possibly an ult or beads. Right? So that can get fairly grotesque. Now, which one of these is going to some extent depend on your situation? For example, I have been known to sometimes bust out a Witchblade because the enemy team had a lot of auto-attackers and I was dying all over the place. So I bust out a quick Witchblade to solve the problem, or, as I'm becoming more fond of as time goes on, a lovely Midgardian Mail. I typically go for Witchblade because of the 10% cooldowns, personally. But either one of them work. Right? But I've also been known to bust out some extra damage because that's what my team needed. Just basically what you want to do is assess what your team needs and what the enemy team comp is, and try to build this last item according to that. Alright, that last item is very flexible, and as a result is something you have to pick at the moment in the moment according to your best judgment. There's really not much else I can say on that other than stay the hell away from auto attack speed. And I don't really recommend anything out of this tree either. There's not much here for you that isn't going to be that useful. There's possibly an argument you could use Fade Blessed Hoops to provide your allies with health shields, maybe. But until more widespread awareness of the fact that it's the Blight Explosions that heal people and not the actual Devour Souls itself, that's going to be, a totally separate conversation, right? So, maybe in the future this might be more viable. Right now, I wouldn't recommend it unless you're in communication with your team. You're like partied up with 4 other people. 5-man team in communication. Yeah, that's a different conversation altogether. That's fine. That is totally fine. Manticore Spikes, you've only really got one ability that's going to trigger this, which is your second ability. That's one Manticore Spike. It doesn't trigger often enough, in my opinion, for this to be useful to take priority over the numerous other items that are fantastic on Hades in the solo lane here, right? I recommend against this. I very much recommend against Sphinx's Baubles. One, you're going to die faster. You don't have that much protections with this particular build here, and I'll be really honest, most solo lane mages aren't building heavy on the protections. They're building a really interesting hybrid mix most of the time. Losing 10% of these, while it isn't that much, in this particular case it's 14 and 12 right here, it's still going to impact you because you're still kind of barely stepping over that 100 protection mark. And what healing your Devour Souls is providing is going to be less meaningful, and that can be a decent enough heal with enough procs of Devour Souls, so you're basically taking away a really beneficial side effect of Devour Souls for your team by building this. So I recommend against Sphinx's Bauble. I've never had this work on Hades. Just get my face stomped in. Griffin Wing Earrings, this is self-explanatory. Stay away from auto attacks with Hades. Right? But other than that, I mean, even things out of this tree might be useful, although as a 6th item, Gauntlet of Thebes would be too late, obviously. Right? And on the really brief moment of, because I'm actually going to probably end the episode soon, make this specifically about solo lane Hades. This has been fairly an extended episode, and I think my episodes are too long. Anyways, my issue with stacking on Hades is the same issue I have with stacking on most anyone in the solo lane. You're kind of banking on not dying early on. And for some solo laners, that's easy. But for Hades, before Hades gets his full kit, he's very vulnerable. I mean, for your first wave, you have to afflict the enemy minions with Blight by auto-attacking them. That takes a little while. So level 1 Hades is a very scared Hades. Okay? Not really a great situation to potentially be looking to build stacks in the future with, right? Now, obviously, Hades usually makes a recovery, but if he doesn't, if he gets ganked a bunch, if he falls behind, building those stacks is going to be very, very difficult for you. Again, remember, your baseline health and protections aren't as high as a lot of your competition is going to be, namely Warriors and Guardians. You have to play things a little bit more carefully. Yes, go in when the wave is there, run like hell when the wave isn't there. Vice versa for the enemy. If the wave is there, they run like hell, or at least try to safely clear your wave. And then when the wave isn't there, they really pursue you. Well, for Hades, again, you've got those lower baseline protections in health. Once you clear the wave and get your stacks, you need to be leaving. And therefore, you also want to make sure you get all the stacks, which means clearing the wave in a very specific way. In an unfortunately fairly predictable way. You've got 2 real ways you can clear the wave with Hades, right? You can precisely aim this move, which I whiffed, which, there you have it. And then you don't clear the full wave, which makes building stacks fairly scary. Or, alternatively, you can stand right at the midpoint between the wave, which is the safer way, by the way, theoretically speaking. Let me show you. Now, I whiffed the first way, the best way to do it. Let me see if I can get this correct the second time, actually. No. Oh, that's because, whoops. Yeah. So you can also, let me just clear that way really quick. I keep forgetting that I'm looking at the line up there, which is where I'm trying to aim, but I'm not actually aiming for it because I'm some kind of dunce. Hold on a second. And we're just going to bust out this move right here, right? And then you clear that there. That's the safe way to clear it. Now, obviously, I have the full flat damage on level 20. You wouldn't blast the back line quite as easily in the lower levels, but that's one way of doing it, right? You have Death from Below, into Devour Souls, kills most of the wave because of the Blight detonations. You can also do this. Boink, boink. Great. However, those are really the only two consistent ways that Hades can clear the whole wave very quickly. And that's very predictable, obviously. So if the enemy is aware of this, they can dodge you, clear your wave, and then box you. Right? Yes, in the long run, possibly the stacks will come in handy. However, it can really throw off Hades' very fragile early game. Right? And by fragile early game, I mean up to level 5. Right? That is a very risky time period for Hades, and it's not unusual for a Hades solo lane to die before level 5, get to level 5, and start making a comeback after that, because he's just impossible to deal with in the middle of a wave from level 5 onwards. Very difficult. Possible, just very hard. And then he basically just gets to do whatever he wants in that lane until he leaves, basically. Right? Usually, in most situations. Again, there are exceptions to this rule, as there are with all rules, but generally speaking, that's how Hades works. But if you're behind at that particular point because you took a fall before level 5, as again, isn't too unusual for Hades, then you're now in this really serious predicament of, oh, I want to build stacks, but I'm behind. And building stacks takes a while. Furthermore, additionally, as I said before, we're not exclusively concerned with power as a solo lane Hades. Now, again, this conversation is totally different from mid lane Hades. I actually intend on doing a whole separate episode for this because we're running close to an hour on this episode, and I don't want to take like a 2-hour episode talking about Hades, for all of his roles. I'm gonna switch it up to a video, an episode per build at this point. But at the end of the day, what you're really talking about here is basically really gambling on playing much safer until you're level 5, so that we can get away with those stacks. And even then, in my opinion, I think that Spirit of the Magus just does more for you in that span of time than stacks will in the future, right? I mean, consider, for example, very specifically, let's take the two examples here. A lot of people are really fond of building Warlock's Staff. Now, at the end of the day, this is only like 115 power and 225 health or so. No, it's more power than that. Hold on. It's 155 power, excuse me. My head math was trash. 155 power, which is respectable, right? And 225 health. Now, let me compare some items that you build in the future, or even instead. Now, Spirit of the Magus is 110 magic power. That's only 45 less magic power than a full stacked Staff of the Magus. But this is immediate. You start at 95 here. Sure, you get 150 health. But when you build only Hunter's Garb, that's 200 health, 25 less than a full stacked Staff of the Magus. Staff of the Warlock Staff. Staff of the Magus. Really, me? Right? As a comparative point. Now let's talk about another item that is very popular to stack. Book of Thoth. One would say, actually, in retrospect, that it's the only other item to stack, but we'll look over that. Now, when you fully stack this is additional magic power from mana. Mana to power from exclusively items. By the time Book of Thoth is done stacking, you're getting, 100 extra power out of this for 180 power. 70 more than Spirit of the Magus. Very respectable. Very respectable. You get an additional 30 out of Breastplate of Valor in this particular scenario. So you get 210. And then another 15 out of this. So you get 225. Very high power. Great. And I will actually say here that if you can pull off the early game, it is entirely possible that you can run Book of Thoth very effectively, stall building Spear of the Magus until your fourth item, build Bancrofts here, and then your Magic Protections is your last item. Totally viable, but it's very, very risky. I'm not. I'm against Warlock Staff. I'm just going to come right out and say it. I'm against Warlock Staff. Straight up. It's for the little returns, it's not enough returns for what it is. 155 power is not worth 75 stacks. 225 health is not worth 75 stacks. It just isn't. Okay? In my opinion, Book of Thoth, bit of a different story. That is a substantial amount of power, but it's risky to build, and I'm also going to be very honest again, this is only really effective against squishier comps. Now, that does happen to be the majority of them. There tends to be 2 frontline, 3 squish. But you do have to be careful with it, okay? If you like Book of Thoth, that's fine. But understand, if you're going to run an item 2 Book of Thoth, that you are taking a risk. And if your jungler, which is the main problem with taking risks in the solo lane, if your jungler isn't paying enough attention to you, you're going to be in some pretty deep waters. Okay? It's going to get fairly unpleasant for you, because in a lot of situations, Hades is a very popular gank target in the solo lane, because a lot of people understand that he does have that lower baseline health and protections, so he's a bit easier to gank. Yes, Hades typically does want the multiple enemies attacking him at the same time. When he's fully built, when he's level 20, when he's busting out 160 protections on his ult, when he's healing for the maximum amount from his detonated blights. In the middle of the game, in the early game, a gank is a nightmare, okay? It's a scary thing for Hades, because again, he does have those lower defensive stats. So, if you're building Book of Thoth, you have 2 risks. One, that you might take a spill in the early game and make these stacks harder to get away with, which sometimes happens. 2, that your jungler ignores you, and the enemy jungler does not ignore you, which is fairly more likely with Hades, hell, any mage solo, than it is with warrior solos, okay? So you've got that more likely threat looming over you as well. So I'm not against Book of Thoth per se, but I want you to walk away from this episode understanding that building this is a risk, and it's a risk that sometimes isn't worth it. If the enemy team is particularly tanky, you're better off skipping this and going with an endgame Soul Reaver, because that percentage of health damage is going to stretch farther than 225 power mitigated by some protections, right? But to finally end things off, when we evolve our Conduit Gem, you might be tempted to go Archmage's Gem. For solo lane Hades, do not. You don't have the magic power, right? We're running, let me rebuild my favorite item here, Soul Gem, really quick. You just don't have the power. That's an additional 20% magic power. We've already talked about how the detonated blights is only half of that, so this is an additional 10% magic power on the detonated blights and 20% extra power on everything else. You've only got 300, well, at this point you would actually have 410, right? You're only getting an additional, heavens, 80 power, 80 extra damage. Well, I say 80 power is more accurate because your abilities aren't 100% scaling, but you're only getting an additional 80 power on these, right? Not the biggest deal for a solo lane Hades. Mid lane Hades, totally different conversation. But that's for a different episode. What we do like is Gem of Focus. Now, Gem of Focus does a couple of interesting things for solo lane Hades. First off, the movement speed we actually don't care too much about. It can come in handy occasionally, particularly with that endgame push, but by and large, I'm going to be really honest with you. Movement speed isn't too important to Hades. That damage increase, though. Now remember, this damage increase can stack up to 3 times. That's a potential 3 to 9% damage increase. Every time you cast an ability that costs mana, literally everything Hades does, you're at full stacks by the time you're ulting. And your ult only takes 4 seconds, so these stacks aren't going to fade by the time you're done with your ult. They'll fade after the fact. So you're getting a 3% damage increase, 6% damage increase. Let me actually put it this way, right? Behold. 3% damage increase, 6% damage increase, 9% damage increase, maintaining 9% damage increase. On top, remember, we have Spirit of the Magus. That's an additional 7.5%. In other words, we're running a full 16.5% increased damage on everything we're doing, including our ult, which is reducing enemy protections by 30 at this point. We're level 20. And it's just a really lovely time. And also remember, we have Soul Gem, which is another reason why I really love Soul Gem. That bonus damage there, that's a 9% damage increase for every damage you're doing, including that Soul Gem. Same thing for Spirit of the Magus' damage increase. That is all sources, Soul Gem included. Bancroft's Talon. Bancroft's Claw, also affected. That Glyph passive, also affected. You're going to slap. Now, we're basically the long story short for solo lane Hades is, instead of building huge amounts of power that the mid lane Hades normally would, what we're doing is essentially replacing that with percentage of health damage, bursts of passive damage buffs from items, and percentage damage increases from items to basically emulate at least some of the damage that a mid lane Hades would be bringing to bear. Additionally, on top of this, I didn't even mention this yet, but Gem of Focus offers 2% damage reduction per stack. By the time we're busting out our ult, we have 6% damage reduction, plus the 10% damage mitigation, plus potentially, and if you're playing Hades right, optimally, 9% damage mitigations on top of that. 19% damage mitigations, an additional 6%. On top of that, 25% of incoming damage is reduced before it even hits your protections. Outside of your ult, that's 15% of incoming damage reduced in a team fight before your protections are even factored in. Again, we are essentially replacing the tankiness a normal solo lane would have with damage mitigation from items. This is why I generally prefer Conduit Gem. Now, again, there is a case to be made for, very specifically, Warrior's Axe evolved into Sundering Axe. There is a case here for those highly damaging comps. Instead of having damage mitigation, we have bonus protections, and we have a percentage health steal. Okay? Is it the same thing? Not really. Alright? I would actually venture to say that Sundering Axe might be better for high tank comps because that is a percentage of their health. So it's really odd, at least if you look at it this way. The Warrior's Axe is better against a high damage... Okay, let me set up the actual idealized scenario for Warrior's Axe before I end this episode. Warrior's Axe. Flat health regen, flat health mana regen, bit of extra protections in the early game. Really good against a high damage enemy solo lane opponent. A hunter, high damage mage, high damage assassin. Great. But when you convert this to the Sundering Axe, if the enemy team is predominantly squishier, this doesn't mean as much. This is only primarily useful against tanks. Yes, it'll still do some decent damage to the squishier targets, but they have much lower maximum health caps. So they're going to be taking a decent bit less damage from this than their own tanks will, right? So if you really want to maximize Warrior's Axe, your laning opponent has to be high damage, but the rest of the enemy team is tankier. Maybe they have a Guardian jungle. And, Anubis for mid lane. Let me set up a hypothetical here. Enemy team has Amuz Cobb in the solo lane, your laning opponent. Great. They have a Ymir jungle, tankier than average jungle. They have an Anubis mid, a damage mage, but has a bit more protection than your average because of his passive. Artemis is a hunter, for kicks. And uh, Osiris as a support. Shout out to good old Metal Effect? Metal Effect. Got it right. Osiris support, right. That's a tankier than average team, but your laning opponent is higher damage. So Warrior's Axe is really helpful, but when you evolve the Sundering Axe, it's a really nice time. I don't generally use Hero's Axe because while, yes, we have a decent amount of max health here, we have 2,700, it's, well, with Hero's Axe, we would actually very specifically have 3,000, which is respectable. It's not a bad health shield. It's just that I don't really find this hugely useful unless it's against specific team comps. Yeah, there are specific team comps where this is really nice. They've got a Fenrir. Maybe they've got Mulan. She's kind of scary. For their, she shoots someone with an arrow. They're not gonna have a good time usually, unless you've got this. You know, there's team comps where this is fairly justified, but I'm gonna be really honest. I don't find myself busting this out too often. Again, this is very context sensitive with specific team compositions, usually ones in which some specific hard crowd control effect is pretty much guaranteed death. Fenrir's ult Poseidon with his whirlpool often means just instant death as examples, right? You can probably think of a couple more in your head that you've had some horror stories about that maybe you would have appreciated a health shield along the veins of Hero's Axe, but outside of those specific situations, I really don't find this useful enough, right? But my general go-to, again, because of its utility and how much it offers us, is Gem of Focus. It's just a really lovely time, right? By the way, at this particular point, we're running 390, just as one final note, we're running 390 power here. Well, guess what? That happens to be good old 5 levels of 75 magic power, which means you are effectively running 2.5% per stack, which you're obviously going up to 3. So now you're talking 7.5% of their max HP for bonus damage, and 7.5% of your max HP for health shield. Have a lovely day on that one. With that being said, that is how I approach building solo Hades, and some things about his kit that you really should know about if you're facing off against him. And as one final recap, if you're facing Hades in the solo lane, do not ever fight him in the minion wave. Do a sweep. Once the minions are all dead, sweep them with your abilities, get the hell out of dodge. Rinse and repeat. At worst, he's maintaining his health levels with his heal. At best, you're chipping away at him gradually. Poke him whenever you can, additionally. If you can. For example, it might be better for Sun Wukong to blast him with some occasional magic cudgel hits when he's not clearing waves, just for that extra poke damage, as an example. But with that being said, I will talk more of this when we do the Hades solo lane episode, but in the meantime, thank you all very much for joining me. If you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. And if you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.